again, class. Welcome back to Tips and Reviews for College Algebra. This is your teacher, Mrs. Depew, and it is Tuesday, June 11th, 2019 in St. Clairsville, Ohio. Our test day is still fast approaching in regard to fractions. The podcast I created on the channel, Relax, It's Only Math, reviewed half of the content to be covered on our upcoming test. That included important vocabulary, reducing fractions, improper fractions into mixed numbers into improper fractions, and multiplication of fractions by fractions as well as mixed numbers. If any of this is not ringing a bell, and if you are still confused, please stop this vodcast and listen to the podcast first. All right, today I would like to briefly review with you where we left off with division, addition, and subtraction. So let's talk division of fractions. Recall from the podcast that you can only multiply and divide fractions by other fractions. So those mixed numbers must be changed into improper fractions. So when dividing fractions, we want to change the problem into a multiplication problem to make the problem easier to compute. So always keep the first fraction, your dividend of the problem, the same. Then change your division to multiplication. Next, you must take the reciprocal of the second fraction, your divisor. So remember in class I said that taking the reciprocal is just flipping the fraction. So the numerator is now the denominator, and the denominator is now the numerator. Now the problem is set up to multiply, which once again is discussed in the previous podcast. And remember to always reduce if possible. Let's move on to addition of fractions and mixed numbers. In order to add fractions, you must have the same common denominator. If they are the same, you can go ahead and add the two numerators together. Only the numerators and whole numbers if there are mixed numbers involved. So the denominator stays the common denominator. So let's say that the denominators are different. You must find the LCD, the least common denominator, and build equivalent fractions. So recall from class that an easy way to find the LCD is to write out each denominator's multiples and find the smallest one that is in common. To build equivalent fractions, start with the new common denominator, then divide it by the original denominator of the fraction you are changing. So next, multiply that quotient, your answer, by the original numerator, and this gives you the numerator of your equivalent fraction over your LCD. Once you have changed both fractions, you may add the numerator and whole numbers if there are mixed numbers involved and keep the denominator the same. So subtraction is not much different than adding, except you are subtracting. So you still need a common denominator. If there's not a common denominator, follow the same steps to building equivalent fractions with an LCD as was just described in adding fractions. So in subtraction, you subtract the numerators and the denominators and keep the LCD. So subtract the whole numbers next if mixed numbers were given in the problem. So let's say you are subtracting a mixed number and a fraction, and the fraction of the mixed number would yield a negative fraction when subtracted. We're not handling negative fractions in this chapter. So you would use the borrowing technique from subtracting whole numbers. So by taking one away from the whole number, you can then change the fraction of the mixed number. Use the denominator that you already have to make your fraction. So let's say it was a whole number 5. Take 1 away to get 4, then use the denominator of 4 from the fraction 1/4 to make 4 over 4. So 4 over 4 is still 1, 1 plus 4 is still 5. You are not changing the problem, just altering how it appears. So next you would add the original 1/4 to 4 over 4. Once again, you do not want to change the whole problem. Now you are left with 4 and 5/4 minus 3/4, which you can now subtract and end up with a positive answer of 4 and 2/4. So remember to always reduce fractions with adding and subtracting. So the final answer would be 4 and 1/2. Okay, so that completes our brief review of part 2 for the review of fractions for our upcoming test. So please look over your notes and your book for further explanations, and do not hesitate to contact me as well if you have any questions. I do hope this podcast was helpful, as well as the previous podcast. Our next podcast and vodcast will be covering Chapter 4 on decimals. The music was provided by Audionautics.com. So please enjoy your day or evening, and remember, you can do math. This is your teacher, Mrs. Depew, saying relax. It's only math. See you in class.